Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Lisandro Quilcue Wash Process Colombia from Kurasu Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kurasu, based out of Kyoto, Japan. And this coffee is our October 2023 Coffee of the Month, as it was suggested to us by Zapperboy100. So shout outs to and thank you to Zapperboy100 for the suggestion. Kurasu is a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before, including most recently during our Japan review series, in which we visited one of their coffee shops out in Kyoto to review one of their Brazilian coffees. And it was during that trip that we picked up this bag of coffee, as it had already been suggested to us, and it felt like a great opportunity to make it our October Coffee of the Month. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Kurasu's recipe, which is pretty similar to our own at a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at between 92 and 96 degrees Celsius. So we opted for 96 degrees Celsius, which translates to about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, so I do have it listed on here that this is on the lighter side of the coffees that they do roast. Kurasu definitely varies the spectrum in terms of the roast profile of their coffees, and even their lightest coffees aren't necessarily overly light by most standards and metrics. I think a lot of people would closely associate this with a medium light, maybe even on the slightly more developed side of that medium light in terms of the roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and it definitely offered a fair bit of brightness right at the forefront with an ever so slight nutty quality and a long-lasting citric aspect to the cup as well. First thing I noticed was that this cup really seems to open up a fair bit as it cools down, as there was much more of a fresh fruit component to it, as well as a sugary sweetness as well. So definitely a pretty decent start. We continue on to day 21 as we opted for the Chemex, and it came out a little bit more different through this brew method, as it was a little more classically Colombian-like in the sense that it offered a little bit more of that nutty aspect, but even this slightly sour and bitter citric component to it. And on the first day we had experienced a fair bit of citrus, but here it was just a little bit more pronounced in the cup. Felt slightly uneven, as the best of the cup continues to come with a little bit of a cool down. At that time it was a little bit more sweet and a slightly more candied as well as sugary sense. So very different on the second impression. We continue on to day 24. Opted for the April brewer, and there were a lot of positives that can be found in the cup, as on this day specifically it was better right off brew before it settled into a more notably sugary fresh fruit and citric direction with a slight berry and almost chocolate component to the cup. And this is when I was really starting to feel a fair bit of those Colombian characteristics even more pronounced on this day. Well, we continue on to day 27 as we opted for the V60 with Kurasu's recipe, and it toned the cup down ever so slightly, as it offered a even more traditional Colombian coffee with a slightly heavier body and an emphasis on the chocolate and nutty qualities. Slightly caramelized, and it had a pretty distinct fresh fruit component that was a little bit more subtle on this day, but even then it was a slight bit more, we'll just say, notable within the cup itself. Day 29, back through the Chemex, and it was another interesting experience, and this is what kept happening anytime I went with the Chemex. So this one was brewed with Kurasu's recipe, and it came out slightly sour in terms of that citric direction, and that was right at the forefront. So given that that's what I experienced from the cup right after it had been brewed, that's one of the main reasons I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the Chemex with this coffee. In addition to that, plenty more of the Colombian characteristics on the back end, a lot more of the caramelized nuttiness in the finish. Overall, just okay. We continue on to day 31, back through the V60, and it feels like it's been better on this day, as there's a slight bitter citrus on the forefront, but what I'm really noticing is that on the back end there's much more of the caramelized sweetness yet again, a notable bit of fresh fruit as well as plenty of nuttiness and a sugary sweetness. So I think they have something listed on here like cane sugar, which makes a lot of sense. There's plenty of a sugary sweetness within this cup, a little bit more in the traditional Colombian sense. Day 33, back through the V60 with Kurasu's recipe once again, and this is the best it's been up to this point, with just a little bit more vibrancy to the fruit components. Notably less of the bitter citrus in place of a slightly more sweet and better defined citric component to it. I believe that they have some orange notes listed on here. Makes a lot of sense. The orange was coming out a little bit more in terms of a sweeter direction, followed well by a more caramelized nuttiness and a chocolate-like base. So a lot of those expected Colombian characteristics. Day 36, final notes, we have one more try with the same recipe, and there's been more consistency as it really seems to open up a fair bit on the cool down. Abundance of characteristics ranging from milk chocolate, nuts, soft florals, sugary stone fruits, dark berries, but for the most part still dominated by the citrus. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, we have a washed Colombian coffee. I feel like that's going to be expected right from the onset that it was going to score that level 4, and level 4 it scored, as there's really not too much to add to this. I feel like the profile within this one is clean enough and well defined enough to justify it being right there at the level 4 mark. We continue on. Finish, level 4. Yes, I've been alluding to this somewhat nutty finish, this more classically Colombian finish to this cup. Even then, it's not overly long lasting, and it doesn't have anything overly specific or distinct about it. 4 seems like a really good placement for it. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, and I feel like if I'm being overly harsh, we might say lower side of level 4. But honestly, I feel like the sugary sweetness, the caramelized sweetness, and even the fruit sweetness that's present within this cup gives it enough different levels of sweetness that it's at least justified that level 4 mark. And especially at times, there's an abundance of the sugary sweetness in this cup that justifies that mark as well. So level 4 seems to work for me. Acidity, level 4. Yes, and this one's actually kind of funny because I accidentally made this tasting wheel twice. And as I was looking at the tasting wheels, the one thing I noticed was that previously I had marked the acidity at a level 3, and the second time around I marked it as a level 4. But I said there's enough fruit brightness in this cup that I feel like the level 4 does seem justified. And as I took that sip right there, I'm thinking once again, I think there's enough brightness to justify that level 4 mark. So level 4 it is. I'm sticking to that, maybe slightly lower side of it. Florality, level 4. Yes, and oftentimes when I get this, we'll say chocolate-like base, there can be a floral component to it. That's what I'm experiencing the most within this coffee, a little bit of that floral chocolate base to the cup, and that's why that scored as high as it did, which is kind of interesting to me because I could say that at times the fruit components all scored that level 4, but opted for the florality given that that was an ever-present and much more consistent thing within this cup. Citrus fruit, level 4. And that's one of the first things I mentioned when we started discussing this coffee was I noticed the citrus right at the forefront. At times it was a little bit more bitter and sour, but some of the adjustments have kind of toned that down to a point where I feel like it's just a little bit more even. A lot of struggles with the chemics on this coffee, and that definitely seemed to accentuate a lot of those more sour and bitter qualities of that citric component. And then we have quite a few level 3s. We will start with the saltiness, level 3. Yes, and that's one of the interesting things when I was making this tasting wheel, and that I found interesting about the 2 tasting wheels I had made was that the saltiness scored at a level 3. And as I'm really thinking about this coffee while drinking it, I said, yeah, it's partially in terms of the nuttiness, but this coffee in general just seems to have a little bit of a salty quality that at times is just as pronounced and just as consistent as some of the other fruit notes in this cup. So level 3 seems really nice for this coffee. Berry fruit, level 3, yes, and I believe they have something like muscat grapes on here. I could see that dark berry profile, a little bit of a grape-like profile to this one, and I don't really have too much to add to that. At times at a level 4, but I would say that since the citrus was much more pronounced than the other fruit characteristics, I bumped that down to a level 3, which is the same reason why we have the stone fruit there at that level 3, because there is a little bit of, I think they have something like an apricot or stone fruit note listed on here. It's there. It's a little bit more in that sugary, jammy sense, as this cup just felt a little bit more sugary in general, but still not quite as pronounced as the citric components in this cup. So level 3 felt like a good place for that. Chocolate, level 3. Yes, and I don't think that they have any sort of chocolate note listed on here, but I think it's something to be expected. I believe this is a Castillo coffee. I believe I was always going to expect some sort of chocolate characteristic to this one, and it does have a really nice soft milk chocolate base to it, so level 3 works well for me. Caramel, level 3, and this is another one of those really sweet things that I noticed about this cup, and it comes in a number of different directions. I would say that the cup specifically had a caramelized nuttiness to it, which is something I've referenced in quite a few of the notes on this coffee, so level 3 felt like a really nice placement for that. Bitterness, level 3. Yes, and that's that citrus, and it may be a little high at that level 3, maybe lower side of the level 3, higher side of the level 2. But I wanted to say that we've reviewed enough coffees where the bitterness reached that level 2 mark, and I really wanted to stand out because it was just a little bit more bitter than those in terms of that citric direction, so that's why I opted to bump it up there to that level 3 mark. Savoriness, level 3. That's the nuttiness. There's a lot of savory nuttiness within this cup, and it's one of those really pronounced components to it. If anything, that could have placed a little higher, but I think savoriness on a tasting wheel oftentimes looks weird. 3 felt like a really nice place to put it. And then final thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel is the body at a level 3. A little bit more medium bodied than I might have expected. I don't think I have too much to add to that. I mean, it is a washed Colombian coffee and not necessarily the lightest, so expecting it to reach that level 3 mark probably feels like where it was always going to place, but as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It's in line with the vast majority of the experiences I've had with Kurasu's coffees in general, which is to say that it offers a fair bit. It offers glimpses of beauty, as there were times I was drinking this coffee and felt like there's so many great things within it. But at the same time, it maybe isn't necessarily quite as enjoyable as a lot of the other coffees that I've reviewed that are along the similar lines, mostly because I think that the slightly more light profile of those coffees tends to yield results that I like a little bit better in those coffees in general. That being said, this one offered a lot of the things that I do enjoy. Clarity, sweetness, florality, as well as a fruit component to it. I think if there's grievances I might have, it's that it's skewed a little bit more in directions that I'm not particularly fond of. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of the citrus. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of nuttiness within coffee. So having this one skew a little bit more in terms of the traditional Colombian profile with a focus on the citric components isn't necessarily going to make it my favorite. But it does kind of finish in that same sort of category where pretty much every other Kurasu coffee I've had is finished, and that's that it's above average. I think it's really good. It's nothing that's going to really impress me, nothing that's going to completely set it apart from a lot of other coffees I've had, but even then it's a very solid standard coffee for what it is. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like that's the first direction I want to point somebody towards, is the much more classic washed Colombian coffee drinker, because it did offer a fair bit of those characteristics. Clean, nutty, chocolate, caramel, and even a nice fruit component to kind of balance that out. I was specifically thinking the darker berries that were also present within this one, but couple that with maybe enjoying some more of the citric-like characteristics of a cup, and you can experience a fair bit of positives within this one. For the most part, I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or anything else from Kurasu as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Lisandro Quilcue Wash Process Colombia from Kurasu Coffee. Thank you for watching.